Thank you, Ginger, for that terrific discussion with Ed Knight. I appreciate that discussion about diversity and inclusion and the leadership role NASDAQ is taking on that very topic. It is my pleasure to introduce John C. Yang, the President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. John leads the organization's efforts to fight for civil rights and empower Asian Americans to create a more just America for all through public policy advocacy, education, and litigation. His extensive legal background enables AAJC to address systematic policies, programs, and legislative attempts to discriminate against and marginalize Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and other minority communities. AAJC has been at the forefront of working to protect the API community from the recent surge in the hate crime that we have all witnessed. John, thank you for being a part of this program.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. John, we've all seen the terrible images of hate crime, attacks on our elderly, young people. And it's really heartfelt, and it angers me. It hurts me as an American to see that our community is being treated in this manner. This is not a new thing, hate crime against Asian Americans, but the velocity and really the audacity of the types of attacks have been, I've not seen it in my lifetime. Can you share some thoughts as to why you think this is happening to our community today?
Sure, and I think there's two principal drivers. On one side is COVID-19. And with COVID-19, what we've seen is a lot of fear, whether it is health fear or whether it is economic fear from everyone in the community. And this includes Asian Americans. But what happens with that fear is that people look for someone to blame or look for a group to blame. And unfortunately, especially with the prior administration and their use of language such as Chinese virus or Wuhan flu, not to mention even worse derivations that we've heard, people got conditioned to target Asian Americans. People got conditioned to think of Asian Americans as the reason for their fears. So that's number one, what is driving some of the horrific violence that we've seen today. Number two is what we have to recognize is real geopolitical tensions with the Chinese government. And we've seen this throughout history, that when we do have these international tensions, there's a backlash against the community here in the United States, and specifically here it's the Asian American community. And why I say that we've seen it throughout history is you go back to World War II when Japanese Americans, and I emphasize Americans, were incarcerated here on our own shores because of alleged and never proven dual loyalties to the Empire of Japan. You fast forward to 9/11 and the backlash against what we saw with respect to the Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, South Asian American communities because of the so-called war on terror. So we've definitely seen these moments, and there are other moments in our American history where we've become a target. So those are the things that are driving it, and especially the spikes that we've seen is this fear coupled with this notion that Asian Americans should be targeted.
Yeah, John, it's such a difficult thing to see and difficult thing to watch. And obviously we've seen situations like Vincent Chan, Detroit auto workers killing him during the during the auto war, the whole situation back then. But it's been like you hear one couple of stories, situations like this, but you don't see this kind of concerted just drumbeat of people getting attacked every day, and do you feel hopeful that we'll see some end to this?
I do and I don't. I feel hopeful that people are very much aware of this issue in a way that they hadn't been before. And when I say this issue is with respect to the violence against the anti-Asian American community, the Asian American community. So in that sense, I'm hopeful that there's awareness, that awareness is starting to bring a response. But I am of mixed minds because what we are fighting is racism. And so in that sense, I see this as another piece of that puzzle that is also George Floyd, that is also Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, that puzzle that includes the movement for Black Lives. That's part of the same arc that we've had during this year, that puzzle that includes the insurrection at the Capitol. And so we have to think about how we all dismantle racism together. And so in that sense, it's not going to be an easy fix. It's going to require all of us leaning forward in different ways to address this issue.
Right. And obviously the racism the Asian American community faces is different experience than the Black community, the Hispanic community, the gay and lesbian community, and so on and so forth. But they're all connected, right? And I guess the work that you do of advocating on behalf of all communities, but in this case specifically for the AAPI community as it relates to hate crimes, what kind of legislative and policy efforts are underway to ensure that we're protected, our elderlies are protected, and now we see that kids are getting attacked, ensuring that everyone is protected out on the streets, out in their neighborhoods throughout the country?
Yeah, so I think there's a few pieces. And before I even talk about that, one thing that you mentioned, Jim, that I do want to go back to is sort of how we've seen racism affect all of these other communities, LGBTQ, the Hispanic community, the Black community. And I think that's one thing that really resonates with me is right after the Atlanta killings, I had an opportunity, we organized a call among a lot of the national civil rights leaders, if you will, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, UNIDOS US, Human Rights Campaign. And when I looked out into this Zoom, and what I saw was not only my friends, but I saw the Charleston Church. I saw the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. I saw the Pulse nightclub. I saw El Paso. And unfortunately, Atlanta has been added to that list with respect to the Asian American community. So again, I see this as us needing to move forward together as far as how we address racism. So when you think about solutions, there's a couple of pieces. On the federal side, certainly one piece would be some of the hate crimes legislation that is pending in Congress. There's one piece called the Jabbar Hire No Hate Act. Representative Mang from our community introduced the COVID-19 hate crimes bill. Both of those are pieces of legislation that we think helps to elevate the issue, give us better data about the issues, and also, especially with Representative Mang's legislation, give additional resources to our community. Because part of this is having criminal enforcement alone isn't going to solve the issue. What we really need is investment in our communities for some really community-based solutions to make people feel protected. Because frankly, police alone aren't going to make us feel protected. Rather, it has to be a community effort. So those are the pieces that are happening on the federal side.
You talk about the solutions, and sometimes we individually feel helpless in a situation like this. And you kind of think about your kids, your grandkids, and the generation to come. What can we be doing individually to create more of a long-term meaningful change so that this is not something that we have to keep hearing about, witnessing for decades to come?
Right. So if you're talking about change and what can we do, in the long term, I do think it's about education. The fact that Asian American history, and again, I emphasize the word American, is not really taught in our K through 12. And what that leaves us with is stereotypes about the Asian American community, specifically this perpetual foreigner stereotype, that no matter how long we've lived in this country, whether we were born here, we are seen as a foreigner, we're seen as other, and therefore we're seen as a threat. And so if you start teaching in K through 12 in high school, in college, obviously, about the 442nd Combat Regiment, the most decorated regiment in all of World War II, that were Japanese Americans who were fighting for the United States while their own relatives were being incarcerated back at home. You think about Chinese Railroad, how they did the hardest part of building the Transcontinental Railroad here in the United States by dynamiting through parts of the Rocky Mountains and part of the mountains to make that connection at the Golden Spike. If you start talking about some of these pieces as part of American history, people will see that, yes, Asian Americans are part of this society. We're not invisible. We're not that other to be feared. The other thing I would say is in terms of what we might need short term, I've talked about investment in our community with respect to federal spending, local and state spending. And also there's little things that I think we just as a community can do. And what I mean by that is one of the things that we've been doing is offering what's called bystander intervention training. And so that allows people the tools. And this doesn't have to be Asian American. In fact, we want everyone to participate in this. When they see an act of hate, that they could do something about it. It could be as simple as checking in with the victim to make sure that they're okay. It can be documenting what happened. It could be getting someone else over to the scene to help with what happens. There's all sorts of different techniques that people can learn. One of the most common things we always hear in these incidents is, I didn't want to make things worse. I wanted to do something, but I wasn't sure what to do. And so what these types of trainings do is really help people with that. Over the course of the last year, we've trained over 30,000 people. We have about 50,000 registered, but we really want to make this accessible to everyone. It's common sense techniques that all of us can do to help make each a little bit more protected.
Well, my dog is not happy about that whole situation either, apparently. But John, thank you so much for those words. You talk about the railroads, right? And the Chinese immigrants built a part of that railroad, the toughest part, as you point out. But we're not ever seen in that photo when they complete the put in that golden spike, that last photo. I think what we have to remind ourselves is that we have to be in the picture. We have to be visible, and we have to stand up, and we have to, fight for what's right for the community. And I really thank you for all that you do and what AAJC does every day to protect the community, advocate on our behalf. That's why AIM is working within our community, investment community, to do our part of raising enough funds to support the good work that you do. We're also working with Stop AAPI Hate, as well as other local groups, to make sure that we are providing everyone with the resource you need to do your job, and so that you can continue to advocate on our behalf in our community. So John, what an honor to have you on this program. Thank you so much for being a part of it.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful to be with all of you.
Thank you, John.